see here. All right, let's get this party started. We're going to let our friends on Instagram in with us. Okay, we are ready to go. All right, everybody, thanks so much for joining me today on today's episode of the Love, Happiness, and Success live stream. We're going to be talking about a very common, very honestly annoying and sometimes confusing experience, which is when you're feeling haunted by an ex. So this past week on Monday, a podcast came out on this topic where I did a deep dive into why this happens. And in particular, the punchline is that there's typically some unfinished emotional business. What people often don't know is that there are 8 very specific steps and stages that we all have to go through in order to successfully detach from a relationship, be able to do the work of growth and learning so that we can move on in our lives, but also into a healthy new relationship. But it is very much a process. And there's basically no information about that in the world. Most therapists, like self-included, have no idea about that. That's not something that I was trained how to do through a master's degree, through a doctorate, right? That was something that I had to figure out through a lot of research, experimentation, and basically developing a system that hadn't existed before in order for me to really understand the different stages and what people needed to do. So the good news here is, though, that once you learn that and know what those are and have some insight into what you need to do, then you can get unstuck, you can do the work that will ultimately set you free. And the best part is that you will benefit from it. In my experience, when people have the opportunity to do this type of growth work really well, they're not just, getting over a past relationship, they're also getting a lot of insight into themselves, their relationship patterns, growth opportunities that serve them very well down the road in a new relationship, but also life in general. That is actually how we evolve. So that is what was discussed on this past week's episode of Love, Happiness, and Success. And again, I'm not going to go into all of that here. I'm here today to talk to you. But if you want to check that out, you can go to my website, which is growingself.com. You'll find in the blog and podcast section a link to that episode. And then also while you're there, if you are curious around what stage of healing am I in with regards to my breakup, go to the free resources section of my website. It's right there at the top. And you'll see the Heartbreak Recovery Quiz, which is how over your ex are you? Answer a few questions. You'll get a report that will also provide some advice on okay, so here's what to do next so that you don't stay here another year, right? So anyway, that's what's going on. But I would love to know what led you to join me on today's episode. Today we're talking about when you're haunted by an ex. You want to move on, but they're still kind of rattling around in your head. And thank you for joining me, by the way. So let's talk. What is going on with you that led you to be interested in joining this particular installment? And what questions do you have for me? That's really why I'm here today, is to hear more about you and hopefully offer some insight, perhaps even guidance that can help you move forward fearlessly, as we like to say. So, who would like to share first? And I'll wait. I know that we have a very awkward lag with our friends on Instagram that might take a minute to catch up, but yeah, I'd love to hear more about what has been going on in your life. If you're haunted by an ex. I know that I certainly had that experience. I went through a terrible breakup in, honestly, it was high school, but man, that was a tough one for me. And easily a couple years after that, it was still very alive for me, even though it wasn't actually a real thing anymore. Yeah. What about you? Who can relate to this experience of feeling haunted by an ex? Maybe we should even just start there, show of hands, and then see if anybody's feeling brave enough to ask a question. Anyone? Okay. Well, if anybody would like to share a personal story or ask a question, that is why I'm here. But otherwise, in the absence of questions, you guys have me for another 20 minutes, and I'll just share some basic information about why people can really get stuck and the kinds of strategies that I have found to be very helpful in breaking free. So I think the most important thing to understand, and again, I go deeply into this in this Monday's podcast episode of Love, Happiness, and Success, and also like everything you ever wanted to know in my book, Xoxo, Breaking Your Addiction to an Ex-Love. I mean, so the research that I did as a therapist, like not having any specific training on how to help people process relationship loss and move on, actually did turn into a book. So Xoxo, Breaking Your Addiction to an Ex-Love. And I think the central idea that many people find comforting is that we are built to bond to other people. And when these bonds are broken, in the sense that the relationship has ended, has nothing to do with the fact that we are still strongly bonded on a limbic level to this other person. And our desire to not be bonded anymore has nothing to do with the fact that we are. It's important to realize that there are actually different levels of your brain and that they work differently and independently of each other. So we have our neocortex, which is our thinking brain. And this is the part that has language, that visualizes things. And it's what we think of when it's our conscious mind, right? It is our experience of self. But wait, there's more. Because in addition to that, you also have this like middle part of your brain that we inherited from our mammalian ancestors. This is a part of your brain that we have in common with cats, dogs, gorillas, elephants, and this is the part of your brain that does not actually have consciousness. It lives in the dark, but it's a part of your brain that feels and that also creates attachment bonds to other humans. So what happens is that there's a thinking part of your brain that's like, I don't want to do this anymore, so the relationship ends. But then there's this other part of your brain and also all these other systems. I mean, your endocrine system, I mean, hormones, like all these processes, because again, nature designed us to bond to other humans, right? But there can then be a conflict because this one part of yourself is very deeply attached and is like sending up these signals to this conscious part of your brain that is like, why aren't you over this yet? And it can be really, really confusing. And so that's why there needs to be an organized, structured system to help you work through all of the pieces to not separate those two, but really get your thinking brain into alignment with your feeling brain. And that takes work. It can't just snap your fingers and do that. So, well, I'm so happy to see you guys and that we have some questions. So let's tackle a couple of these. First of all, hi, Arlen. Thank you for joining me today. And oh, good. I'm so glad to know. So Arlen shares she took the test and found out that the weak spots are grieving and emotional healing. Can you give us some more tips on those areas and what questions to ask ourselves to uncover emotions? Oh my goodness, this is such a good question. And hello, Sirius. Nice to see you again. I'm glad you're back today. So Arlen, this is fantastic. And so just for our friends maybe who have not taken the assessment that Arlen is speaking of, if you go to my website, growingself.com, free resources section, it is Heartbreak Recovery Quiz that will give you a snapshot, ask a bunch of questions and a snapshot into which of the 8 stages of healing you're kind of like stuck in. And so, believe it or not, it is actually the 3rd and 4th. Honestly, it can sometimes even be the 4th and the 5th stages of this healing process are related to grieving and then also the emotional healing. So tips on those areas. First of all, and so I always feel so weird talking about this and like tips because that makes it sound like it's easier than it is. And I just want to manage everybody's expectations so when I say tips, we're actually talking about a process that usually takes at least a few weeks. Okay, so I just want to say that out loud. But when it comes to a grieving process, I think what most people don't realize is that the work of grief is feeling the feelings and connecting with the various aspects, actually, of loss that go along with a lost relationship. So there are certainly different ways that you can make contact with these feelings, but my number one tip is to actually give yourself permission to enter into a period of time where you are not okay and where you are actively making contact with the sadness that comes from these feelings of loss, which honestly can be very scary to do. I think that our culture does not make a lot of space for us to not be okay. I think that our culture tends to reward people who get over it kind of quickly, right? So sometimes you have stuff to fight through in order to be able to even do that. But then I think there is a systematic way that I work with clients, certainly, and which I've been experimenting with in a new program I'm putting together that help you identify and then individually grieve all of the other dimensions of loss above and beyond your relationship with that person. Because many times when relationships end, we know that there were problems with the relationship. We get that the relationship was maybe a mixed bag, right? Like there were parts that were good, there were parts that were not good. So, but it's going through and really sitting with, these are the aspects of the person that I miss, but also thinking about, these were the things about my life that I really liked that changed when this relationship ended. It could be access to a social circle. Maybe you really loved this person's family and they loved you, and that feels like it's gone now. Many times people will feel like they lose parts of their identity through a relationship loss. And if that just rung a little bell right there, make sure that you listen to Love, Happiness, and Success podcast. I think not 2 weeks from, maybe it's 2 weeks from now, I actually interviewed a researcher who explores identity and relationship loss and how that can impact us when we're going through a relationship. So by identity, I mean, like, what did it mean about you that you were in that relationship? But also like, when we're with different people, they can kind of rub off on us, and sometimes in positive ways. Maybe you take up a new hobby or develop new interests or had shared experiences that were organized around your life with this particular person. Maybe you traveled a lot. So those things can all be areas of grief. Sometimes people grieve like the time that they lost in a relationship that proved to be not great in the end. That can feel like a lot of sadness. And then sometimes, there are even other layers of loss. I can't tell you how many times I've had, particularly women who entered into a relationship in their early 30s and who really wanted to have a family. And they were in this on again, off again kind of toxic thing until they were 38. and then it ended for real. And now they are facing the reality that they might not have biological children. And that represents a whole other layer of grief. So there can be a lot here to tap into. And so you're asking for specific questions. I mean, it's hard to know what questions to ask in the absence of understanding what there is for you to grieve. But I would, at the very least, open up a journal and be like, I'm feeling sad. And how does that make sense? I think is always a nice way to get into that. And then, of course, when it comes to the emotional healing, there's a lot there. So first of all, this is interesting. Most people don't know this. The experience of grief, like sadness, loss, that kind of thing, can actually mask a lot of other dark emotions. And so until you've gone through a grieving process around loss, you actually won't be able to easily connect with many other feelings that need to be acknowledged and then not processed, not gotten rid of, but actually listened to. Things like anger, guilt, regret, fear, dark emotions, low self-esteem can also be part of that. But the work here is to actually go into these and understand, how does this make sense? What is this teaching me? And then use that information in the next steps of, I've extracted this wisdom from my dark emotions, but how am I going to apply it in my life? So, and just to let you guys know, because there's so many different things here, I've been working on some different resources to help people move through this process. So the questions to ask, the homework assignments, the journaling prompts, what to do with this information once you extract it. So in addition, that breakup recovery quiz that I mentioned on my website, so growingself.com, free resources to that heartbreak recovery quiz that will show you what stage you're in. If you take that, obviously you'll get a report, you'll get an assessment, but I will also know how to get in touch with you, because this new system that I've been working on is going to be available in a few weeks. And I'm not going to do crazy things with spam, but I'll just send you a little note, here are the resources that I was talking about on that live stream the other day, so that you have access to that. Oh, great question, Harlan. Maybe that was more information than you wanted or needed, but that is the truth. So thank you for it. Okay, I think we have time to tackle one more question together before we call it a day. And again, if you're just joining, today we're talking about why people get haunted by exes, right? Like why it can be very difficult to move on from heartbreak, based on the episode of Love, Happiness, Success podcast that came out on Monday. So for more info, you can check that out. Okay, so our next question comes from Paul. Hi, Paul. Thank you for joining. And shares, I'm devastated from a breakup, dreading that tomorrow is Valentine's Day, right? You're doing okay this week. This is week 10. But you're feeling your emotions rising already. How do I get through the day? Okay, 2 different strategies. Both are valid, and you might even use both of these tomorrow. First of all, okay, a couple of things. There is no benefit in torturing yourself unnecessarily. It's one thing to be working through dark emotions in a structured plan that is going somewhere. That's incredibly beneficial. And we have to be in contact with those feelings in order to do the work of growth and healing that will set you free. And if you're not using those emotions in that way, it can just kind of feel like emotional torture. And you don't need to do that to yourself. So door number 1, Paul, honestly, is to make a decision that it would be in your best interest to find some other things to do to take your mind off this particularly hard day. Make some plans, go to the movies, try to do something fun. It's totally okay to do that. And at the same time, option 2, what you can do, and which could be constructive, is so, back to Arlen's question, like, how do you work through a grieving process? Many times it is helpful for people to use triggering events, so holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, even like familiar places, like if you guys always went to the same restaurant, like that kind of thing, in order to go into grief more deeply and effectively. So if tomorrow is Valentine's Day and this is a big day for you guys, it could be that this door of grief is going to be open even a little bit wider than it usually is. And so to use this as an opportunity for productive grief and to be journaling about how you feel and how this makes sense and the things that you missed the most and really connecting with what you lost. But the danger here again is that there is a difference between doing that kind of emotional work in a way that is productive, that is intended to like move you towards something, versus just like simmering in a broth of pain that feels like it's not attached to movement. That's hard to explain. I mean, anybody of you guys been in therapy or like a structured process where you're moving through this and like it's going somewhere versus just like sitting in it and torturing yourself? I've certainly experienced that difference in my own life. So that's my advice to you, Paul. And I don't, that might be even a question for you. Like, I don't know where you are in this process. Are you in a process? If so, use it constructively. But if not, it's totally okay to like try to find a way to have as nice a time as you can and distract yourself from some of this too. So to balance those two things. I hope that helps. But also, Paul, take that quiz that I was mentioning, that breakup recovery quiz. If you haven't yet already, it will show you the stage that you're in. And that would also give you visibility into what to do differently. Because so, for example, it's going to look different if you're just still like in that withdrawal phase. And it's also going to look different if you haven't moved through the relationship clarity phase, because if you're still stuck in that, you won't even be able to do the work of grieving that I was just talking about, because like in your heart of hearts, you still want to get back together. And that is also going to obstruct grief if you haven't done that part of the process yet. I'm probably making it sound more complex than it actually is. I mean, there's an organized system for moving through it, but you got to know where you are in that first. So anyway, if you haven't taken that quiz yet, go to my website, growingself.com, free resources, and then you'll see it right there. But good luck with things, Paul. Good luck. And you will get through that day. All right. Maybe one more question. We have 4 more minutes. Okay. Steve, thank you very much for being here today. So Steve, oh, thank you. That's so nice to hear. So Steve shared something nice, that you found value in the podcast, associated quizzes. And thank you for saying that, because a lot of times when I do this, I'm just like throwing bottles into the ocean, sitting by myself in my office recording podcasts. So anyway, that's awesome. And okay, so interesting that you say that this is a process, and find it interesting that at times the initial feeling of loss seems to come in waves. Yeah, it really does. I would be curious actually to hear more about your experience of that. Like what stage of this you're in, because I think the withdrawal stage waves feel different than the grief stage waves, than the emotional processing stage waves. So, but you bring up a fantastic point, which is that when you are in a mindset, when you're connecting with memories, when you're connecting with feelings, it can kind of feel like one after another. But I am so pleased to hear that you identified these and are using the term of waves. And everybody here dealing with this, I'm glad we're going to end on this idea. Emotions are feelings. They are physical sensations, literal physical sensations. We'll feel it in our throat, in our chest, in our stomach, right? And when an emotion comes on, it is very much like an ocean wave, right? And it lifts you up and you are in the grip of it for a minute. And when people run into trouble is when they try to escape that, or they make a lot of negative meaning out of having a feeling, right? They like start having feelings about the feeling, when in reality, if you come back into the present moment and notice, oh, I'm getting lifted up by a feeling, that typically in between 60 and 120 seconds, if you allow yourself to just notice what is going on inside of your body mindfully, the wave lifts you up and then it'll pass. It goes right back down. Now, to your point, Steve, you might have like 4 of those in a row, and that's okay. Nothing wrong with that. But just to remind yourself, this is not harming me. Nothing bad is happening to me. I am making contact with a physically felt feeling related to the fact that I've lost an attachment bond and that my body is experiencing this as well as my mind. And that allowing this to kind of go without fighting against it is one micro skill that is involved in this larger healing process. And so I'm just so glad that you're, aware of this and doing it. Okay, you guys, that is my meeting timer telling me that I have to wrap this up. As a human with ADHD, my life is ruled by an elaborate series of timers and lists. So I gotta go, but thank you so much for joining me today. Oh, and I'm noticing that there were some other questions here that I wasn't able to get to. Hopefully we can address those together on another live stream in the future. And actually, we're going to be talking about heartbreak recovery for the next few weeks. I was thinking about Valentine's Day too, Paul, and like there's so much like, cute couples in the air. And I was thinking about like, what about the people who are grieving relationships? Let's do that for a while. So for the next couple weeks on the Love, Happiness, and Success podcast, that's what I'll be talking about. And then I will be here next Thursday talking about this again. We're actually going to be talking about why your ex moved on so fast, if in fact they did, because that can be really triggering for people. But hopefully we'll get to these other questions too, because they're all kind of related. All right, you guys, thank you so much. Good to see you, and I'll be back in touch next week.